Alrighty, I am here with Dale Ahlquist. We are going to be talking about G.K. Chesterton and The Everlasting Man, which is a fascinating book. I feel like I've read Orthodoxy and I've read certain Chesterton essays, but The Everlasting Man feels vast and it feels different, and it feels like Chesterton is covering all of human history and doing it in a way that I've never read anybody who is able to just break down all of these different historical facts in a way that he does in this book. And we'll get into all of it in this podcast. Before we start though, Dale, can you just, I don't know, maybe introduce yourself to people, tell them a little bit about who you are. You wrote this guide to Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. And so that's sort of why I reached out to you, but you want to tell them about yourself and who you are?
Sure. I have been running the Society of G.K. Chesterton, formerly known as the American Chesterton Society, since 1997. That's when it was formed. I took an interest in Chesterton some 44 years ago when I first started reading him, and I started with this book, The Everlasting Man, and fell in love with Chesterton and have never turned back. I have I did a master's degree on G.K. Chesterton. I've written 6 books on GKC, and I've edited 15 or 16 books. This one here kind of falls between the cracks because it's both edited and heavily annotated, but I've written introduction and commentary, and so it's what I've added to the book is the same, doubles the size of the book. So it's partly having authored a book that someone else has already written.
Yeah. Well, your commentary is really helpful. I mean, there were certain times, because Chesterton's such an interesting character. I feel like when I'm reading him, it feels like, obviously he's like a bigger guy. So I imagine him just kind of bumbling around and going from topic to topic, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming when, I'll go from reading somebody like J.I. Packer, who's like a very logical, very straight-laced writer, to Chesterton, who kind of just maneuvers through ideas, and your commentary is really helpful. I want to start by talking about this book's influence on C.S. Lewis. You had mentioned in a different podcast I listened to on Pints with Aquinas that when C.S. Lewis was a young atheist, he came across The Everlasting Man and he read it, and he later on explained that it was the best explanation of Christianity that he had ever read. What was it about this book that really turned C.S. Lewis to Christianity?
Well, as you know, C.S. Lewis had a very logical mind. He's like your friend J.I. Packer, lays things out very orderly, and you just, the natural, one thought naturally follows the other, and just so cleanly reasoned.
Yes.
But Chesterton, of course, takes you on the scenic route. He never wanders from logic, but he seems to wander from the subject. But it's only a way to get you there from a more surprising angle. What C.S. Lewis found in Chesterton was not only a marvelous writer, someone who, lit him up intellectually, but also aesthetically, because C.S. Lewis was, someone who loved English literature. He found in Chesterton a beautiful writer, beautiful use of words. But he also said he was the first one who ever made a rational case for Christianity. Lewis himself initially read Chesterton as a newspaper columnist and several of his other books, and said he would be very good if not for the religion. If we'd stop, we'd just stop bringing religion into it.
Yeah.
Well, when he read Everlasting Man, he was caught by the argument and pulled along and taken all the way there, so that he was backed into the position where he couldn't get out of it. And so much so, Andy, that he really ended up using all of Chesterton's same arguments when he wrote Mere Christianity.
Wow. And so did he just sort of put it all together and package it in a different way in Mere Christianity? Because I have never read Mere Christianity, which I should.
Well, you'll
how
enjoy
did he? Yeah, sure. How did he package it differently?
So I'll tell you a funny story.
Yeah,
a lot of people have heard this. Maybe I even said it on the Pints with Aquinas thing. But the first person who ever told me to read Chesterton told me this while I was sitting there reading Mere Christianity. And said, "Have you ever read G.K. Chesterton?" I said, "I've never heard of G.K. Chesterton." And he said, "Well, if you like C.S. Lewis, you'll love G.K. Chesterton." And then he said, In fact, if you read Chesterton, you don't even need to read C.S. Lewis because all of C.S. Lewis is in Chesterton. Now, that's a
Wow.
remarkable and
Yeah.
bold and blasphemous comment. Well,
Yeah.
I tucked that away in my head. It was about 3 years before I picked up my first Chesterton book, and it was this one. It was The Everlasting Man, because
Wow.
C.S. Lewis had recommended it. And as soon as I heard the name Chesterton for the first time, all of a sudden I started seeing his name everywhere. And
Sure.
and so, Everlasting Man, it was a tough first read, tough place to begin. There's many, many, many better choices to pick up first from G.K.
Sure.
Chesterton than this one.
Sure.
But this one,
I would say
he puts it all together. But I will tell you this, 44 years of reading Chesterton, all of C.S. Lewis is in Chesterton.
wow. Okay. Wow. That's a big statement. And so I've read some of his essays too. It could be good for people if they want to start with Chesterton. He has a really good and kind of funny essay on cheese, but that's like an economic essay. It's really amazing about kind of like localism and things like that. Anyways, that's a massive statement that all of Lewis has found within Chesterton. One thing that I don't know if I know, is Chesterton like a highly educated person? Did he go and get his PhD, or it feels to me like when I read him, he has some of this, he isn't as polished as the big PhD people, but I don't know if does he have a degree? Does he have a PhD?
No. Wow. He had a bunch of honorary doctorates. He got honorary doctorates from probably about 5 or 6 major universities, including the University of Notre Dame. But he dropped out of college. He never even got a college degree.
Wow.
And so he was a journalist. He was self-educated, but he wrote primarily for the newspapers. His books were only an additional thing that he wrote. He was not primarily he was never an academic writer, but he wrote for a popular audience, but he wrote without ever underestimating the intelligence of his audience. So he makes you think when he writes, but he certainly never used footnotes, and he never wrote like an academic writer. And so you don't get works of scholarship from him, but you do get massive amount of knowledge because he read so much, and he can pull so much into what he's saying. And of course, that's what you get out of The Everlasting Man. How does he know all these references?
Yeah.
Just incredible.
That's literally the exact same. I was thinking that as I'm reading, I was like, what is all of this stuff? How does he know any of this? So before we get into all the details of The Everlasting Man, can you just give a breakdown as to what exactly this book is about?
Great. Well, you said, I think you said when you were reading, you felt like you're reading the whole history of the world.
Yes.
And I guess in a way it is the whole history of the world, because it does begin with the man in the cave. That's part one. And the creature called man is the first part. And the second part is called the man called Christ. He chose those two titles for the two parts of his book because this book was written in reaction to a very famous book by H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, who'd written a book called The Outline of History. And H.G. Wells, very much the atheist, materialist, writes a history of the world where mankind is simply another animal that has crawled out of the muck, and that Jesus is just another man in history. So Chesterton's dispute with his friend H.G. Wells, with whom he didn't agree on anything, but they were friends and they exchanged ideas openly. His whole point was to say H.G. Wells missed the main character in history. He missed the main character in the story, which is Jesus Christ. First of all, Chesterton sets about to establish that mankind is different from everything else. And secondly, that Jesus is different from every other man. And any other possible explanation that you try to make will not be satisfying and will not be believable. So the first part is the history leading up to Jesus. The second part is history after Jesus. What happened after Jesus came? How did history change completely? If you think about it, it's the same two divisions in the Bible. You have the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Right. Can you sort of break down I guess part one of the book about, I think I remember, if I'm remembering this correctly, he talks a decent amount about like this idea of the prehistoric man, and that there's really no evidence. And maybe I'm not racking my brain well enough here, but he talks about the prehistoric man. Can you explain his argument about the prehistoric man? Because I thought, as I was reading it, that was fascinating, and I had never heard anybody who had kind of gone after some of the scientific, assumptions of our time of the prehistoric man, and it feels like all these scientists know so much about the prehistoric man. What did Chesterton say about the prehistoric man?
So his whole point about prehistoric anything is that it's written, it's before history, so therefore we don't know anything about it. History is a recorded event. Prehistory means there's no record. So there's no record of the events before history. So all you can do is speculate as to what happened when there was no record made. And so even in recreating what prehistoric man looked like, it's all speculation. And when talking about how prehistoric man behaved, it's all speculation. And it's been drilled into us by paleontologists who assume a lot of things when they are describing how prehistoric man behaved, that the general public just assumes that these authorities know what they're talking about. Chesterton has the courage to be a little skeptical and ask them, how do you know this is? Because any logical person will say, if a bone is found 30 yards from another bone, they're not necessarily from the same individual. But that's what they were doing in the reconstructions of some of these prehistoric creatures. But especially the pre-hominids, the pre-humans. But his main point is that there's only one thing absolutely for sure that we know about prehistoric man. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know how he treated his wife. We don't know really how he prepared his food or what he ate. We know one thing about him, absolutely certain. He was an artist. He painted drawings on the wall.
Yes.
And we have that hard evidence. So the first thing we know about prehistoric man is that he's human. Because humans do art, animals do not.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. And as I was reading, it was very interesting because I grew up and I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a very progressive place. And I went through the public school systems, and there were all of these sort of axiomatic presuppositions that you just had to accept while going through science class, biology class, all of these different classes in high school. And one of the things that I always wondered was like, how do we actually know any of this stuff? And I had never heard any even Christian theologian or just thinker sort of kind of attack the whole idea of, we don't know what's prehistoric because it was before history. And Chesterton goes right after it. And seeing him do that was very interesting. Why does he think that human beings, I know that you said that animals don't do art, but human beings create art. Why is that such an important thing, though? What is it about art that Chesterton sees as sort of a differentiating factor compared to other animals?
Well, his great line from the book is, art is the signature of man. Art is a purely human thing. And art, of course, is part of our story. It's part of the story of civilization. The story of mankind is that man is an artist. He creates. And, when we study our own creator, we are told that he made us in his own image. In other words, he made us to be creators as well. We have these godlike qualities in us because God gave those qualities to us. All Chesterton is doing without, reciting chapter and verse from the scripture, he's giving you more evidence without even having to use the Bible as a text. He's putting the proofs out there. Man is an artist. He is creative. He can create something out of nothing. He has this imagination that is always looking for something. And this will become a theme in the first part of the book, that man's artistic striving is trying to grasp something, grasp this truth that's always trying to escape, try to get it at the last minute. And of course, he'll argue that truth is only found in revealed religion, in Jesus himself. but the
Sure.
artist is always seeking the ultimate.
Can you kind of track that theme through the first part of the book a little bit for people, just so that they can get an idea of, I mean, because that first part of the book is like it's pretty vast, it's pretty long, and he covers a lot of ground, obviously, like a ton of history. Can you just kind of hit on some of the main points that he makes as he leads up to the sort of the fall of Rome, and then what ends up being the birth of Christ?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the main themes in this is absolutely essential to understanding the first part of the book, and that is that he says, when you compare, the other thing about man is he's a religious animal. Animals are not religious, but man is. But when we try to compare religions, and the classic way we compare religion is in a column, and you say who the founder of that religion is and what their beliefs are. You compare. Right. They don't really compare well. They don't stack up well against each other.
Yeah.
They're that much different. In fact, one of his funny lines, it's not from this book, I think it's from Orthodoxy. He says that most people say, well, we all pretty much believe the same thing. It's just how we express it is different. Well, Chesterton, in his use of paradox, says, well, actually, it's just the opposite. The way we express our religions are quite similar. We have rituals, we have sacred texts, we have candles, we have music, we have processions. Yeah. All religions actually look very much the same. It's what they believe that's completely different. It's just the opposite. Yeah.
Yes.
So he proposes a different set of categories to understand the development of religion and the development of civilization. And it's a very unusual and unanticipated list, unpredictable. So the four categories are God, the gods, the demons, and the philosophers.
Which is
that's a strange list.
Yeah, that's literally what I thought. It's like, where did he come up with these? So
that's what you thought.
Why? Yeah. Why did he think those were the four categories?
Well, I'm going to tell you, Andy. That's why I'm here.
That's why. There we go.
Off. All right. So
sorry.
No, it's okay. That's why I'm here. God.
Sure.
God. He says that's the first cause. That's the ultimate meaning, the ultimate being in the universe. Everyone every normal person has a sense of God. Even the atheist is always thinking about God. He's just trying to figure out ways to deny God. All right. But everyone's always thinking about God. They know that there's this God. But and then he says each tribe in the early world probably had their own God for that tribe. They had a name for God. But when they encountered another tribe, that God had a different name. So, okay, well, let's just combine our gods. And so that's how the polytheism comes subsequently to monotheism, not the other way around. So people just started combining their gods together. But without the benefit of a revealed religion where God himself reveals himself to his creatures, like, as he did with the Jews, as he does in the story of the Old Testament. All religion can do is do its best on its own to seek God. It's the natural pagan religion. So Chesterton does not criticize the pagans. He gives them as much credit as he possibly can, because naturally man is seeking God. Naturally man is seeking a meaning, but the way he does it without the benefit of a revealed religion is through art. So it's the poems, the songs, the drama, the paintings, the sculptures. They're depicting this mythological world where they've identified these truths through certain stories. They repeat those stories over and again. And it's not that the myth never happened, it's that the myth always happens. That story is always happening. He says you read the Odyssey because all of life is a journey, and you read the Iliad because all of life is a battle. And so these mythological stories have these fundamental eternal truths in them, but they're they're all the work of imagination and of seeking the ultimate meaning without the benefit of reason or logic. Okay, it's just all imagination. So then so that's the gods. The gods would be mythology and the poetic attempts of paganism. We'll skip the category of the demons and go to the philosophers. The philosophers are using just reason and logic. They're trying to solve the problems of trying to solve the meaning of existence by just working it out like a set of mathematical problems.
Yes.
And he says the thing that's so brilliant about philosophy is that, those early philosophers, we are still using their thinking today. Their thinking is still as logical as it was 3,000 years ago.
Right.
Nothing has changed in terms of logic. Logic doesn't change. But what's happened with the philosophers is that they never really had any theology to them. It was, and there's never a theology in polytheism either. You can only study one God. You can't study the gods. There's no theology. They're just these very human-like personalities doing their misbehaviors, and you make a sacrifice to them just to get the best odds on your luck. Maybe things will go for you. So because the river of philosophy and theology goes parallel, they never intersect till you come to Christianity. Okay, so now do the people who believe in the gods really believe in the gods? Probably not, he says. Probably not. But what they do believe in is that there are other supernatural forces.
Yes.
And they believe in the demons. And that's why they believe in witchcraft and spells and curses, because the people who go to use these things can get results. And so the demons are real, and it's the shortcut to act is for people who want action to get things done. It's always dark, and it always goes dark, and it always is compromising. So his history of the pre-Christian world is you have mythology, the gods, you have philosophers, philosophy, the philosophers, but you also have this real evidence of dark forces, of demons. And his great example, of course, is Carthage, which is this highly developed civilization, very artistic, very educated, great commercial system, industrialized. It's got everything. It's an advanced civilization. But they also throw babies into a furnace.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, does that sound familiar?
Yes, yes. When I was reading that, I was like, so the United States of America, basically, yeah, which is terrifying, because Chesterton didn't have very nice things to say about Carthage, especially as it relates to them burning their babies. Why were they burning these babies?
Because they were making a deal with the devil. That's it's real simple. They were worshiping this god called Moloch.
Yes,
it sounds like an evil god. Yeah, but it was truly an attack on life itself. Chesterton says that the superstition about witchcraft is that it prevented childbirth, and it has this hatred of children. And the dark gods have this hatred of life, because that's what God does, is he creates. The devil can only destroy.
Do you think that the United States, because to draw that parallel, it's interesting, the United States seems to be maybe stuck in between two categories, because there's a philosopher category of sort of at least before I was born in 1999, so I was kind of on the tail end of this sort of atheistic, hyper-rationalistic sort of worldview, the new atheist, and people sort of have rejected that a little bit more in the past 5 to 6 years. But then you're saying that, killing babies is sort of indicative of a belief in this dark demonic world as well. Which category do you think the United States is in right now? Are we shifting in between categories because things are weirdly unstable? Or what do you think Chesterton would say about the United States?
Chester does say, he says that all four of these categories, Andy, are present at all times.
At all times, okay.
And some are more prominent than others. So in a perfect society, you have God, and he's properly worshipped. You have art in its proper place, which is trying to express the inexpressible, which is what art does. You have philosophy in the right place, the use of logic for good things. And you actually have the demons in the right place, which is to be avoided, but they're there and you have to do battle with them. They're always there, and you always have to do battle with them.
Yes. Well, that makes sense. Can you... So I this morning was reading the book, and I got to the end of part 1 and the end of chapter 8. I think chapter 8 is called the end of the world. And there was a lot in there in that last chapter, and a lot that reminded me of the United States and what's happening right now in the time that we live in. That is, compared to the fall of Rome. And a lot of other people have made this observation as well. I've read Francis Schaeffer, and he sort of makes similar observations. And it's a little bit terrifying. Like when I finished that chapter, I was like, oh, okay, this is not good. We are at the end of a world, either at the end of the world, maybe Christ comes back, or just at the end of a world, this world that we've built up in the United States and in the West. What does that actually look like? Like, what does Chesterton describe as the end of the world before Christ came 2,000 years ago?
Well, he said, civilizations come and go. So we have to remember that. We live in one of the probably the most advanced civilization in all of history. Yes. But there's nothing that will guarantee that we won't fall and completely collapse and be ruins in 200, 300 years. Everything we see around us could be in ruins if we continue going the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Rome was the greatest civilization for centuries, and it collapsed. It fought Carthage because Carthage was worse, because Carthage was killing babies. But then Rome itself decayed, and it decayed instead because of eroticism, because sexual anarchy. And he said mythology does not begin in eroticism, but it does end in it. And so he makes that's another just absolutely prophetic point in this book, is that the absolute fall of good moral behavior, which is first of all an attack on the normal, which is the family. The family is always the basis of every civilization. If you have a strong family, you have a strong civilization, and if the family becomes weak, you have a weak civilization. And certainly that's what we're witnessing today, and no one could deny it. And so, the end of the world could be the end of our civilization, or it could be the end of the world, the end of the human story, which is the culmination of the plan of God and the return of Christ and the new kingdom. But I think we know enough about the way the story is written that it's only going to end when it's basically there's no hope for it to improve.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so I have to believe, and I think any good Christian believes, that there's always hope that we can turn this thing around.
Yeah. Right.
It's one or the other, right? We either collapse and decay and that's the end of it, or we turn things around. There's a revival. People start turning to God. Yes. That's happened before. I mean, the end of the last Roman civilization was the start of a new Roman civilization that civilized Europe and civilized the world because it was Christian.
Yes. Yeah. What do you think Chesterton would have said, though, about some of the advancements in technology moving into transhumanism and things like that? I think that is sort of the differentiating factor. We talk about Rome and they still existed in sort of a mimetic world. Like nobody had this poetic sort of subjectivist postmodern worldview back then. In to the degree that we have it today, because they were just subject to the whims of nature all the time. Whereas in the modern world, medical advancements, even, Neuralink, putting things into your own body, you have technology, you have phones, you have all of this stuff and you have food that's like just, we don't even know where what is McDonald's made out of? Like, we don't you have all of this stuff that's sort of manufactured and artificial in the world that we live in today that is different from from the fall of Rome 2,000 years ago. And it feels like it accelerates the immorality. I know it's a big question, but do you know what Chesterton would think about any of that?
Well, you could say, on the one hand, you could say it's different. On the other hand, you could say it's the same story. It's happening all over again.
Sure.
Because Rome had advanced technology as well. And, they were a very advanced people, and it all collapsed. It had to be rebuilt, basically. Look at Egypt, look at Babylon.
Yeah.
Look at some of the great Chinese dynasties. They're covered by sand.
Right.
But Chesterton really does write specifically about the modern philosophers, not so much in The Everlasting Man, but the place he takes them on is Orthodoxy, which is sort of the companion book you have to read to The Everlasting Man. Of course, I'd recommend you read Orthodoxy first and then The Everlasting Man.
Sure, yeah.
But in Orthodoxy, his whole point is that modern philosophy, if you take it to its logical conclusion, will end in madness.
Yes.
Any modern philosophy, you take it to its logical conclusion, it'll end in insanity. And
Calvinism.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Right? And Calvinism.
His argument about Calvinism, he's against Calvinism, which is in many ways the basis of many modern philosophies, because it's determinism. Yeah. So when he uses Calvinism, he's talking about determinism, that there's no free will. Chesterton will always defend free will. And so his attack on Calvinism, and this would be your double predestinationists, that we have no free will at all, that God is completely omnipotent, and therefore we can't make our own decisions about anything because God knows what you're going to decide. Yes. And Chesterton says the only sane way that you can approach that is with understanding truth paradoxically.
Yes.
The paradox is that two things can both be true, even if they contradict each other, but they have to both be true in order for the larger truth to exist. Therefore, there has to be an omnipotent God, but there also has to be free will. And even if those two seem to contradict each other, they both have to be true, because the result is insanity if one of them is not true. If we have no free will, then why are we having the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Why do you say please and thank you if there's no free will? There's no reason to do it. But if there's not an omnipotent God, then there's no meaning. There's no ultimate meaning to things if God isn't omnipotent. So you have to have both.
Yes.
And his way of explaining it in Orthodoxy is so beautiful. He says, just like we have two eyes and we see things stereoscopically, well, each eye technically sees something different. You're seeing two different pictures at once, but you're seeing them at the same time. And it's because you have this contradictory information coming into your head makes you see things three-dimensionally. Yes. And he says our spiritual sight is stereoscopic, just like our physical sight. And his attack on most of the modern philosophers is that they always are attacking free will. Every time they say everything's a biological explanation, or everything's a psychological or an economic, and it's always attacking free will. He says if you take any of those to their own conclusion, it's insanity.
I think it's a really important point. I grew up in the non-denominational church, sort of Baptist roots, went to a couple of Baptist churches, and I'm Anglican now. I don't think I'm 25, but I really strongly disagree with the Catholic conception of justification. And that's sort of where things stop for me. But I will say that Orthodoxy for me was one of the best explanations of Christianity, because the argument that there are these paradoxical truths at the core of the Christian faith that you have to believe in faith. It's like what we do as Christians is important. And I've seen it in the kind of Reformed Protestant realm, this idea that you can rationalistically explain every single thing, what ends up happening, as far as I've seen, is that they start to get rid of important truths in the Bible. And one of the main ones is in communion. So it just becomes in remembrance. This is merely a symbol of Christ. It isn't actually him. And there's multiple Bible verses. It's very weird because growing up in that world, there's multiple Bible verses where Jesus just says, "This is my body. This is my blood." He's very clear about this. Drink my body, or eat my body, drink my blood. And they will take, I think, exegetical license to say, well, that's just sort of metaphorical, and so they kind of pick and choose and decide because they don't. Again, I'm sort of attacking this. I'm not trying to attack them. I think they've done a lot of really good things, but there seems to be this inability to live in the mystery and the paradox of the truth that Christ is giving us, and it needs to be explained. Do you think that that's an accurate explanation of what happens, and it causes this kind of going crazy, this insanity?
You're sounding like a Catholic there, Andy. You better be careful.
I look, I'm only talking about communion. I'm not talking about Mary. It's two sacraments. Trust me. I'm Protestant. Trust me. But the thing that I'm saying, because I don't think that it's what I've heard. Go ahead.
This whole explanation of Protestantism is that it's always breaking off from something else. It's always, you're always protesting. You're protesting against something else. And every time you break off, you're something smaller than what you were. Yeah. Every Protestant denomination is something smaller than the church you broke off from. And the Anglicans did the same thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm not arguing. Yeah, no. And I wouldn't argue for a lot of the schisming that happens. You have people who are like, I don't like the worship music. I'm going to start a new church. It's like, all right, well, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, though, like, I don't think that the idea that there's mystery at the core of the Christian faith, I don't think that the Catholics own that. I think that that's just the Christian faith. That's what it is. You put your faith in belief and trust in this mystery that you can't totally rationalistically explain, and that's what it means to live by faith, not by sight. That's sort of what Christianity has always been, and there's a massive portion of Protestants who I think have gotten caught up in the modernist philosophies and then the postmodernist philosophies and have thought, I need to just rationally explain all of this stuff. And then when you get to the level of you can't rationalistically explain it, they start to just disregard stuff. And so Chesterton's explanation in Orthodoxy, to me, is like a call back to like, hey, hold on. What are we doing here in the first place? We're believing in these things not because we can fully explain why God came down as a baby. And like, you can't explain all that stuff. Anyways, just to defend my Protestant, I think that you can find that in Protestantism as well. But I guess, do you think that that's an accurate explanation of what happens in some of these, maybe even hyper-Calvinist or very Protestant denominations? Or
I think Chester's explanation of what happens is that the Protestants eventually are protesting against other Protestants. They've lost what they originally were protesting against, which was the Catholic Church, but now they're protesting against smaller versions of that. Yeah. And eventually they're going to protest against the central doctrine, which is Christ himself. And that's why you get these very, we don't take anything in the Bible literally. We can't even say Jesus is Lord because we're not quite sure about that. And so they just become a smaller version of Christianity. Yes. So finally it's just a feel good. You should behave yourself. Try to be respectful of others. Yeah. And they can't even quite agree on the 10 Commandments anymore. So, but Chester says that's sort of a logical progression.
Sure.
And, he was an Anglican for a long time. He tried to consider himself an Anglo-Catholic, that he was part of this long heritage of Christian belief that dated back to Christ himself. And so when he talked about the church, he was talking about this body of believers, but at a certain point, he had to come to the realization that, it was the Catholic Church for him. It was the original church. It was the Peter who was the first keeper of the keys, and his successors are still the ones running the church. Mm-hmm. And that the Anglicans were something broken from that, and he didn't have, he couldn't justify it anymore in his own head that he was part of that same tradition. I think what did it for him too was he said when he was asked why he became Catholic, or he said what convinced him to become Catholic. He said it was the Protestants that convinced him to become Catholic.
That, as it is for many people, to be completely honest with you.
Right.
Why did Lewis not become a Catholic? Because this was a heavily influential work, The Everlasting Man, and obviously Tolkien was influential. Both Catholics, Tolkien and Chesterton. Why did Lewis not make the jump?
Yeah, I love that question. I love it. I'm going to give you my answer, okay?
Because he was a lot smarter, right?
Yeah. Think a good thought. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's great to hear the debates about why C.S. Lewis didn't go all the way when he became a Christian. Why he stopped at Anglicanism. People forget he was an Ulster man. He was part of Protestant Ireland, so he had sort of an allergic reaction that was almost inborn to the Catholic Church because of his own upbringing. That's one explanation. I think that's not a very good one, but I'll let people rest with that one.
Sure.
Here's the more mystical answer, and then I'm going to give you my answer. I haven't given you my answer. The more mystical answer is the reason that C.S. Lewis didn't become Catholic is that so many other people could become Catholic. Because a lot of people who read C.S. Lewis end up becoming Catholic, but they probably never would have started reading him if they'd known he was Catholic.
That's interesting.
He does, because he just brings, you've gone from Baptist to Anglican. A lot of that happens a lot with folks who start out just kind of evangelical. They love C.S. Lewis, but then all of a sudden they want something more of their liturgy. They want something more traditional in their faith that the things of just the last 100 years or something are not satisfying them. So that's the more mystical answer. But here's G.K. Chesterton's answer. And you're going to say, well, wait a minute. He didn't even know who C.S. Lewis was, because they never met.
Sure.
But here's his answer, okay?
Sure.
He wrote a book on the mystical poet and artist William Blake. Okay. And in that, William Blake was a mystic and he was a painter and a poet. He wrote some really marvelous poetry, but he was a little odd. He said he had visions. He painted pictures of Old Testament prophets that he saw. He had seen, he painted them as he saw them, and people just wondered what it was that William Blake really believed. And they said, is he even a Christian? They couldn't quite determine that based on his writings. And Chesterton, in his book on William Blake, says, well, if every man lived 1,000 years, every man would be either one of two things. He'd be a nihilistic atheist, or he'd be a member of the Catholic Church. He's either moving away from the church or he's moving towards the church. And William Blake, he says, was moving towards the church. He just didn't live long enough to get there.
Sure, I've heard that. I've heard.
The thing about Chesterton saying that, Andy, is that Chesterton himself was not Catholic when he wrote that.
That's Wow. What in the world? That is a weird thing to say as a Protestant. It reminds me a little bit of Jordan Peterson. It makes me think of Jordan Peterson because even the mythological answer that you gave, there's been a lot of speculation around, well, if Jordan Peterson were to come out and say, I'm a Catholic, it would turn a lot of people away who he was otherwise influencing because he's deeply embedded in the psychological world. And it's an interesting argument. As a person who grew up with these Baptists, I like the Puritans. I like John Owen. I like some of these guys. There's a part of me that's just like, that is so cowardly. Just make a decision and just tell people I'm this or I'm this, tell us what you are and stop playing games. But on the other hand, I can see how there could potentially be a benefit from for people who have such massive influence, like a C.S. Lewis, like a Jordan Peterson, not just coming out and being like, this is what I am and this is what it is, and trying to convince everybody to join that. And it may be just I'm just too like dogmatic or something. I don't know what it is, but that isn't. I take that as an acceptable answer. It's very strange that G.K. Chesterton said that when he was a Protestant. I don't even know what to think about that, to be honest with you. But it's a very fascinating thing. One of the things that I think is interesting, it's more so I see it in Orthodoxy, and I think he does it in Heretics. I haven't fully read Heretics, but I see it a little bit in The Everlasting Man. Is there's this. And we talked about it a little bit, the fact that he doesn't have a degree. He dropped out of college. He's got this confidence of a superior intellectual, and he's not arrogant or rude or anything like that.
That's a good
but
point.
He's confident and he knows what he knows and he's read what he's read. And he's not somebody who's just going to be told, well, you don't have the credentials, you're not allowed to talk about this. Whereas in today's day and age, it does feel like if you don't have the credentials, people just really won't listen to you. Why do you think Chesterton was just so confident in his own abilities without having any sort of governing body of professors tell him how great he was by giving him a piece of paper?
Well, I love that question. That's a good question.
Sure.
I love the C.S. Lewis question because I've heard it before, but I actually have never heard this question before. So I love it in a new way.
Awesome.
Yeah, because Chesterton, he did have an air of authority to him because the truth that he spoke, Andy, was just self-evident. When you get a good Chesterton line, you just can't argue with it. It's just when he says the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting, it's been found difficult and left untried. Well, you just think about it. That's absolutely right. Now, you don't need a college degree to say that. It's a self-evident truth.
Yes.
And his great witticisms, his great one-liners, they are truth nuggets, and he would just drop them on the table, and they would bounce, and people just clung to that. What's the hilarious thing is you have these scholars who will write these books, but they'll always either start the paragraph or end the book with a quote from Chesterton. Because he's the one who just encapsulates the truth and gets it right in one sentence. And that's the one they appeal to. People appeal to him because he speaks the truth. He's not lying to you. There's nothing deceptive. He's an honest and humble writer. You were right when you said doesn't ever come off as arrogant. He's always just, humbly suggesting this is possibly the right way to think. And he admits his own shortcomings, and that's what people are drawn to. They're drawn to his goodness as well as his truth. Yeah. But he became an authority just by speaking the truth, but speaking it with love, with a humility and with a respect for the people he was speaking to.
It's interesting because I just took I do like Peterson Academy. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's Jordan Peterson's academy. He did a whole 8-hour class on Nietzsche, and which is really interesting. And I'd never really read or heard anything about Nietzsche. But one of the interesting maybe parallels between Nietzsche and Chesterton is I know that Nietzsche was like a genius, and he was sort of led into his university at an earlier age, and they made accommodations for him. But he ended up leaving the university. He wrote all these books. Not many people understood it. And he was sort of outside of the system, whereas Chesterton was outside of the system as well, the academic system. And it felt like it gave them the freedom to kind of go after some of these presuppositions that a lot of people have within the system. And it feels like today, I interview a lot of theologians. I love theology, but one of the issues that I see in modern theology is there's a lot of retrieval and rewriting things that have already been written. And to be completely honest with you, have been written way better. Like, I don't really want to hear a modern theologian write about something that G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis wrote on, because I just don't think that they're going to do it very well. But then also, Chesterton was talking about the issues of his day. he was sort of like he wrote for the newspaper. He talked about the problems that existed. I may be just noticing this on my own, but a lot of theologians today are just talking about things that have nothing to do with what is actually happening today. Like I haven't heard of modern. Do you see that as well? And why was it?
Chesterton was arguing that people are no longer connected to reality. So he was very prophetic in that sense that that they basically have taught themselves to believe lies, but they've also taught themselves to take trivial things as important. He says, there's nothing as astonishing today as the importance of unimportant things, unless you want to add the unimportance of important things. So God, he always had an eternal reference point, and it's funny that you contrasted him or compared him with Nietzsche, because I think that's probably the biggest contrast you could have between two people. In fact, Chesterton writes about Nietzsche, and he's the example of the philosopher that takes his own conclusions to the point of insanity. He ended in insanity, and yet the modern world takes Nietzsche seriously. They take his ideas seriously, and they are absolutely destructive, bad thinking. They need to read Chesterton and not read Nietzsche.
I totally agree, and obviously Chesterton is much more interesting than Nietzsche, and is correct, and Nietzsche is wrong. The only comparison that I was drawing was they both were outside of the system, and it feels like
a good one.
Yeah. So the beginning of part 2, he creates this interesting connection that I think you mentioned earlier on between the cave that Christ was born in and then the cave of the early man. What is the significance of this cave? Because I'm not fully through that chapter. I just was reading it right before we came on this, and he's talking about the symbolism of the cave, and then he also is like frustrated with certain people and maybe theologians who are like, no, it's not a cave at all, and he doesn't like that. What exactly is he talking about when he makes this comparison between the caves?
I mean, first of all, it's poetic because he has the man in the cave, the God in the cave. It works nicely.
Yes.
Because you also have Christ's tomb is essentially a cave too, so you have that as well.
That's true. Wow.
You have the Garden of Creation, but you also have the Garden of Gethsemane, but also the Garden of the tomb.
That is interesting.
All this, he has these nice literary and artistic parallels, but his point about the God in the cave is that this is that moment of the nativity is where all those 4 categories that we talked about before, they all come together. Because there you have God himself. God is in the flesh, but it's God who has appeared in this cave.
Yes.
You have the gods, meaning the mythologists. They're represented by the shepherds. The shepherds are the ones who look up into the sky at night and create all those myths and all those imaginary artistic attempts to explain what the gods are up to. So the ones who were staring up into the sky, guess what? The sky opened up, and it really did have divine creatures coming out of it for the first time. So they show up in the cave, and then you also have the philosophers show up. They're the wise men. They're the ones who have been looking for the truth and seeking the ultimate in wisdom and seeking the ultimate meaning. So they show up. So you have God, the gods, and the philosophers. But the demons also show up because what? Herod's killing babies, isn't he?
Yes.
It's the same thing as Moloch. It's the same war against God's creation in its most innocent form. Herod is killing babies. The demons are at work too. It's beautiful, beautiful way Chesterton puts it all together.
That is beautiful. And you just explained that all to me. Who else is even doing that? Like, who else even writes that way? As I've read through the Nativity story and the birth of Christ a million times, every Christmas is great. I love it. And when you start the book, you're sort of like, why are you bringing these 4 categories into this? The gods and the God, what is all that? And it sort of feels like he just kind of pulled that from thin air. And he's like, oh yeah. And you're like, it makes sense, but where is that from? And now, based on what you just said, it sort of all kind of comes together. They're all coming here to see. They're all sort of, led here to Christ, who's in the cave. It's fascinating that he's able to put all of that together, because I would never have thought of that personally.
No, it's a really brilliant analysis. It's totally original. There's nothing else that exists in literature like this.
Yes, nothing. So I will ask you, sort of to wrap things up, and I know we've talked a little bit about this, but I'm very interested. Chesterton was around 100 years ago. Obviously, there was turmoil, and what was right around the corner was 2 world wars and the world sort of changing forever in his time as well. If Chesterton were alive today, I'm sure he'd have a lot of opinions on a lot of things, and he would write a lot of good books, and he would be wonderful to listen to. What do you think he would be focusing on? Would it be the same things that he was focusing on 100 years ago? Or would he be warning us of what's to come? Or what would he be saying about, maybe I'll just throw this out there. Do you think he would have anything to say about AI and artificial intelligence? Like, what do you think he would be talking about today?
Well, we have the great advantage of not having to imagine what he would say, because we have everything he did say.
Yes.
My entire work, my entire life is to try to get people to read Chesterton, because he is so prophetic and profound and timely. And so if your listeners want to look at our website at chesterton.org, our Gilbert magazine comes out every 2 months, and it just is so timely, showing what Chesterton writes about these things, including AI, including, all of our modern technology, but also our modern economic and political problems as well. He seems, as someone else said, he seems to be writing more about our time than the time he lived in. And so, if I take it down to one sentence, it's from 1902. Chesterton says, "We're learning to do a great many clever things. The next thing we're going to have to learn is not to do them." Yeah.
Wow. That's exactly right. That's very good. That's very helpful. And it's another sentence that he can pack a lot into one sentence. It's very good. Oh man. Well, I need to just keep reading G.K. Chesterton. And every time I read him, I'm like, this guy he's a little bit crazy, but I love him, and he's awesome. He's bumbling. I just imagine him bumbling down the streets of London, sort of like giving his opinions on things. And some people are intrigued, and some people are like, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy. And he's just an interesting character. And when I finish the book, I will let you know what I think. But Dale, I really appreciate you taking time to talk. It's just really helpful. And the goal of this was just, I want people to read G.K. Chesterton, and I want people to, my podcast name is Orthodoxy. And it really, after I read his book, Orthodoxy, that was sort of one of the turning points in my faith, because it helped pull together a lot of loose ends and things I just was struggling with understanding. Chesterton sort of tied it all up nicely and handed it over. And I was like, well, this is very helpful. So Dale, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. Your work is fantastic, and people should go check out. You said, what's the website that you?
Chesterton.org.
Chesterton.org. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
My pleasure. God bless you, Eddie.